Welcome into another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
I'm your other host, James or Jexic, and today we're really excited to have on Robert Hovakimyan, a game designer and developer.
Hello, I'm honored to be the guest that knows the least about Summoner Wars on the history of this podcast. So I'm excited.
We're happy to have you. Why don't you start off and give us a little background on how did you become board game designer and developer? Did that just happen one day? Did you just wake up and be like, I'm designing a board game?
Kind of. I mean, I didn't go to school for it. Obviously it started from a love of playing games. I think I got kind of into the hobby, quote unquote, of playing board games seriously and not just for fun in 2018 or 19, something like that. Probably 2018. I think the first time I tried to actually design something was early days of COVID. We had a COVID scare in our house, and so we may have interacted with somebody who had COVID, and so we were all freaked out. And so I just had to be isolated in a room. And for whatever reason, I was like, what if I made a solo mode for Through the Desert, which is a Reiner Knizia tile placement game that I love. It's one of the first games that I really got into. It doesn't need a solo mode. I never really tried it, but that's the first time I started really thinking about it seriously, in the sense of I'm going to actually try to write down some rules and see, what it's like to try to develop or design. That was the first thing I did and never saw the light of day, and I don't even know what's happened. I think I just wrote it down on a note card somewhere, and that note card is probably in a recycling bin somewhere in the world.
It should be in a museum.
It really should not. I don't think there was anything noteworthy on there. Maybe one way that I was really exposed to it was I entered the Ivy Games Discord server when they had their Moonrakers campaign going on Kickstarter, and that Discord server really grew during COVID. We would play online with each other a lot, lots of stuff, not just Moonrakers, but we'd play Twilight Imperium online with each other, or whatever on Tabletop Simulator together. And I got to know the people there. So Austin, Zach, and Max were the three designers, and I just became friends with them. And then I became a mod in their Discord, and then they would take us out to events to help them demo their games. And so kind of getting an inside look on how people do it was really helpful. My first paid design gig was with them. They hired me to work on Luminor, which was a project related to Moonrakers, which is you take your Moonrakers base game and you use it on a Steam app, and you can play a cooperative half video game, half board game with it. So that was my first kind of foot in the door.
Nice.
So what did you do on that project? Program, or did you how'd it go?
Zach, one of the designers, he created basically an app through Unity that just lets you. I mean, you could call it programming, but anybody who actually programs would kind of scoff at it. It was you create kind of a tree where if player does this, then this or this. It's just a bunch of if, else, or statements basically. It was really similar to board game design, coming up with missions essentially, because the idea is kind of like a roguelite where you go through a bunch of missions that are randomly kind of generated, try to beat the boss at the end. And if you die, you just start over. Really similar to board game design, but kind of doing it on a computer for a digital product instead of a physical one. But it was in the same realm. Stuff that I learned there certainly carried over to making physical games.
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of games nowadays have a digital adaptation, whether it's the exact same, and it's just for Summer Wars, for example, has an online adaptation that's just its own website. But even if you look at some of the bigger names of the board game industry, whether it's Gloomhaven or different aspects, have actual game you can go buy for PlayStation. Or I think that aspect of board games is really growing, and I think a lot of these designers probably look at that as another way to keep their game alive and existing. So your first design, was that Moon Rollers then?
Kind of. The first game that I ever tried designing, the first thing I ever tried designing was the Through the Desert thing. The first game that I designed and got really deep into playtesting was called Bombs Away, and it never saw the light of day. And that also rhymes. In terms of first, nothing that was my first ever saw the light of day. Maybe the first 7 or 8 games I tried designing, nobody's picked up. Moon Rollers was the first game of mine that came out. So it was the first game you could buy, and the first time that I saw a physical product of mine on the market. But the first game I signed was Bebop. That was the very first contract I got. So Moon Rollers happened after Bebop and Shuffle and Swing, but just the timeline on it was so so fast that we ended up having it out before those other two games.
And Bebop was picked up by Bitewing, who you've now had a couple games that you've worked with them on and you've designed for them. And another one that just got announced recently, which we can get to in a little bit. Nick and Kyle from Bitewing, did they just take a chance on you, or did you have a really good pitch for them, or how did that process go about?
So I reached out to Bitewing for Bebop because Bebop was inspired by two Kinetia tile-laying games, Samurai and Babylonia. And I think the biggest Kinetia fans, at least in the United States, but maybe in the world, are two guys who run Bitewing. So I thought it would be a good fit for them. I thought it would be like an easy in, so to speak. Not easy, but, I would have a very clear, this is a Kinetia-esque game, which is seemingly all they had published at that point, pretty much, besides, I think, Trailblazers. So I sent him, Nick specifically, I sent him a pitch email, and he was like, no thanks, but you can show these people. And he listed out a few other publishers that might be interested. So very polite rejection. But then I joined the Bitewing Games Discord server and got to know them a bit and talk with them. And I think around that same time, Nick had also started up like a Reiner Kinetia enthusiasts Discord server, which I also joined. So we just started talking more. And then I was playtesting some of the stuff they had coming out. I think it was from Ryan Courtney. They just maybe a year ago or something had this like little Trailblazers mini expansion. So I helped them test that. And so at some point I basically just convinced Nick to like test my game, to test Bebop, veil it as a pitch or anything. I was just like, you want to try it? And he was like, sure. Kind of like, I've been trying a lot of your stuff. You owe me. So he ended up trying it and he was like, dang, that was really good. And then he got Kyle to try it and then they ended up signing it. So it was largely a matter of just perseverance. I don't know if that's going to work every time. I didn't befriend them for the sake of getting my game published. I just realized, well, now that we're friends, it might be easier to show my game again to them now that they know me personally. And I found that's true of any time I've tried to pitch anybody a game. It's like if you know the person, it's way, way easier than just sending a cold email off into the ether and then getting a response back via text. But if you've seen the person or at least talked to them online, voice chat, not just text, I think it really makes it easier for you to pitch because they trust you on some level. They're like, yeah, we have similar tastes. We've seen your feedback from testing. We like it. That was really the thing that sealed the deal, was having some kind of friendship or even acquaintanceship, if that's a word, with a publisher.
Yeah, I can see that helping.
So playtesting, if someone's interested in game design or game developing, could be like the first foot in the door to that world almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't just doing it for IV, I was also doing it for Lacerda. Lacerda has an open Discord where you can join and playtest. I don't do it too much anymore, but I did do it maybe once every 3 months or something for a year or two, and that really helped. I think what really gave me kind of the confidence was I really respected and still respect Lacerda as a designer. I was like, how do you even make something so epic and grand as some of his or most of his games are? But then I remember the very specifically the first time I playtested was like an early prototype of Weather Machine, and I thought to myself, that kind of sucked. But then I saw slowly like it get better, and I was like, oh, it doesn't have to be good from the get-go. Like it's just gonna suck, or like not be good. Like relative to seeing like all the finished products that I'd been playing of his, seeing like an early one that wasn't that good gave me the confidence to be like, okay, it's not about making something and having it immediately work. It's about taking something that's bad or not good, but has a kernel of goodness in it, and just slowly whittling away at the not good and letting that kernel grow. And so that just seeing the process helped give me confidence and also teach me how it goes. Like, where do you start? How often should you play test? What kind of things he would ask after playtest sessions, stuff like that.
It reminds me of this Tom Lehman quote, the guy that did Race to the Galaxy and some of those games. Mm-hmm. He said he often asks his playtesters, is there a game here?
Uh-huh.
And did I find it? Yeah. So it's like, you just got to ask some basic questions, and then like whether it's even worth going for. But then once you do know that, then you can kind of, like you said, whittle away at what's not working.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that quote. I didn't hear that. That's a great one. Look at Tom. What a guy.
So it's obvious that you've taken some inspiration from Kinetia in your games, at least a couple of them. Are there other aspects of like board games that you've taken a lot of inspiration from, other designers or other games?
Yeah, I would say so. I think, I don't know why, but I mean, maybe I do know why, but I'm very much drawn to auteur theory in all arts. So like whenever I think about categorizing music, categorizing books, categorizing movies, categorizing games, I categorize them by designer or author or director. Like for whatever reason, I've just bought into that like auteur hype. So I think about like Tarantino or whatever, or Frank Herbert, or like that's how I organize them. I don't think about the publisher or the studio. So same thing with games. I think about Knizia Games. Other big designers for me are Kiesling and Kramer out of that same German school. I like a lot of Eric Lang's stuff. Lacerda, like we said, Martin Wallace. So yeah, absolutely. When playing their games, I definitely had moments of like recognizing their style, just like you'd recognize the style of a director. And I think that was really appealing to me, of being like, you can express yourself and have your own style as a designer. And so in the beginning, it was very much kind of like mimicking. So like Bebop is me mimicking Knizia. Shuffle and Swing is like me mimicking Lacerda, but on a much lighter game almost. But then like slowly you kind of like grow into your own, and you realize, what things you like from other designers, what things you don't like, or what things you prefer to be different just because of your personality or your play style or the way you want to express yourself. So in terms of the board game world, yeah, I'm always inspired by other designers. Not just like playing the games, I also try to make it a point to just like read the rules or watch the rules for a lot of games as often as I can. So like channels like the Dice Tower and Watch It Play It are super duper great for that, because they just have consistent, high quantity, solid quality output. And so I can just like have that in the background and be like, oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about using cards in that way before, and that might inspire like something that I save in the back pocket. And then a year later, I'm like, oh yeah, I can use this here. So yeah, being inspired by games all the time.
Speaking of using something in a unique way, 3 of your games, Moon Rollers, Shuffle and Swing, and Bebop, all use dice in slightly different, very unique ways. Was that something you like thought about when you were making those? Was that just, you were like, oh, this is just an easy mechanism to use, like using dice in a game, people are used to dice, or how'd that come about?
That was on purpose. I think it's because for a large part of like the first 2 or 3 years of designing, my inspirations would be very mechanical or gimmicky or clever, I guess. I'd be like, okay, how can I use dice but differently? I mean, I like dice as a component. I just think they're fun, and I know that people have grown up with dice. So I maybe had this rationalization of like, if you put dice in a game and make that the center of the game, it's less scary to people. It's like, oh, a dice game. I know dice. I can handle this. But honestly, the motivation was just like almost like a mental exercise of like, how can I use dice differently? So like Bebop is like, what if you had a tile placement game like Babylonia, but the tiles were dice? What would that look like? Just maybe kind of to constrain myself in some way, like to give me some constraints under which to work, instead of having this like open canvas where anything can happen. It's like, no. Tile placement with dice, super constrained, to make that game, to give me some direction. Or Shuffle and Swing is like, what if your workers were dice, which had been done before, especially by a lot of Italian designers. A lot of those Italian Euro games have dice as workers that pip up and stuff, but using it in a different way. So yeah, that was on purpose, and I think that just shows that my original inspirations were a lot more mechanical. I'd think of like a mechanism of like, ooh, how can I, use this cool little mechanism I've come up with in a game.
Have you ever started with a different impetus, like instead of mechanical, more just saying like, how do I recreate this situation in a game or something like that?
Yeah. So yeah, nowadays it's not very mechanical. Nowadays the inspiration is something more feeling based. Like instead of thinking about like, oh, what clever mechanism can I put in, I try to think about like, what kind of an atmosphere can I create at the table? So I think about what kind of things I want the other players to say to each other, how I want them to feel, what I want them to say after the game, and just kind of like imagine them playing the game. Even if I don't know what the game is about, I can imagine them being like, do you have any threes? And then, the person's like, I don't have any threes. It's like, no, I think you have some threes. Like, I don't know what that game is, but I just want that feeling of like wanting to suspect what somebody has in their hands. Like, what game can bring out that kind of suspicious, curiosity between players and what they're hiding in their hands. So I think now it's driven much more through feeling, or through like, for lack of a better term, like game theory or game philosophy stuff. Like one of the games I'm working on right now that Aaron's tested, it came out of having a conversation with a friend who was talking about older games tend to have phases. So he was referencing like Age of Steam, for example, but a lot of older games have phases, Cosmic Encounter, whatever.
Power Grid has phases.
Power Grid. Yeah, exactly. Where instead of like on your turn do one of 6 things, it's like, no, now we're all going to auction. Now we're all going to do this, and then we're all going to bid on turn order, and then we're all going to take a tile, and then we're all going to lay track or whatever. Instead of being like, on your turn, you can decide, do you want to lay track? Do you want to pick a tile? Do you want to bid for turn order? And we were talking about how that kind of phasey structure forces players to interact more, where we all have to build track right now. Like, this is the turn, we're all building track, you have to do it. And so we're kind of forced to like zoom in on a part of the game, and we all have to compete there for a moment. You can't be building track while I go off and like draft a special tile, because now we're just like in totally separate places, which is how more modern design tends to be. And so I thought about how to abstract that idea of forcing interaction via phases, but on a grid. So it's like you have this grid where you would place tiles, but instead of being allowed to place a tile wherever you want, the game tells you, no, we all have to place into the blue zone now. And then we have to all place into the red zone now. And then we all have to place into the green zone now. So you're zooming in on parts of the map, just like you'd be zooming in on different actions in an older game. And that ended up, inspiring an entire game that grew to be more than that, but that's still the core of that game. So it's less about mechanism and more about feel, or more about just like game philosophy, however to say that, without being too facetious.
Yeah, I think there's benefits to both of those like design aspects of like having phases or not having phases. For example, I find that like when games have phases, it's easier for a new player to not fall as far behind. Like they are almost forced to do similar aspects. I mean, everybody's going to do their own plays still, and then there's still going to be like a variance in points, but the variance in points or whatever scoring system it has might be closer because they're being pushed to do these different actions at these times instead of like, for example, I played Blood Rage a while back, and I had a friend, we were playing like a 5-player game or something, and I had a friend who only drafted the sea monster and like attack cards. And then for the next 3 rounds of play, tried to get into like 1 or 2 big battles with the sea monster. And because they have that freedom in like the action like phase of Blood Rage when you're using your rage, they were able to do that. It wasn't effective. One of the lowest scores I've seen in Blood Rage, but I mean,
wow, way to call them out.
I
How do you
mean,
feel
I'm
about
just
that,
saying.
Josh? Dang.
It's like an interesting aspect of like you are not forced to do certain things, and therefore you can do very poor plays or like very great plays, but it doesn't have that structure, so it doesn't force you to do certain plays. It doesn't give you those railroads. It doesn't give you those bumpers to keep you in your lane.
I think even if you can make poor plays, I mean, which you can in older games that have phases, you at least feel like you have a direction instead of being like, here's 7 actions, pick one. I think you're right. A new player would be like, I don't know which one to do. Which one should I do, guys? But if the game's like, we're all going to build track now, then at least you have some focus. And then your question is like, okay, where do I build track? Which is a much easier question to answer than which of the 7 options do I pick? And then within each 7 options, how do I go about each thing? Like, that's just way too many options for a new player. So I agree. I think it totally adds to accessibility. So
in your board game designs, obviously, like you were talking about earlier with Moon Rollers and like Bebop, some of them take like longer periods than others. Do you have like favorite aspects about designing these board games that you've had? Is it often like a tedious process when it's a longer process? Do you prefer them to be shorter if possible? Like, how's that go about?
I think the most exciting part of designing a board game is having the initial ideas for it. Because in your head, it's so great, and you can picture the people playing it, and it's going to be tons of fun. And often, that's also where I found the most fun in the game does come from. Like if it's a good idea, and you've thought about it, a reasonable amount of time. It's not just a second, like, okay, I'm going to make a game. I've thought about this for a second. You've thought about it for like, a few hours or over the course of a few days, but you're still like in the idea phase. You haven't actually put anything down to paper. When you do put it on paper, if there's anything that's fun about the game, it's going to be like whatever that core kernel, like initial idea was. That's going to be the funnest part. And so in the beginning, it's fun and also in some sense kind of easy because it's very obvious. Like, oh yeah, this is definitely, sticking out like a sore thumb. We cut it. So the first like 80% of design is the most fun. And then when you get into like the last like 15 to 20%, that's when it gets a bit more brutal, where you're making changes for the sake of like fixing the game, fixing kind of issues with the game. And these changes are a bit more related to like balance or like, numbers crunching. Like, should this cost 3 or 2? Should this, house on the board be here or should it be here? How many tiles should each player have? Things that aren't related to like the core spark. But they're still important because if these things aren't right, players won't actually be able to access the core spark. They're getting in the way of that. So they're still super important and they can absolutely make or break a game. But for me, they're not that fun to work on. To the point where I now try to design games that don't need that much balancing. Like I actively avoid needing to balance stuff. So like if players can like purchase cards, I do not want to figure out how much money each card should cost.
So you prefer like an auction or something?
Exactly. Or? Instead, I'll put them up for auction, or I'll do like a river where it's like, it's like 2, 4, 6, 8, and then just the order they come out in. If you wait longer, it'll become cheaper. If you buy it sooner, it's more expensive. So I don't have to balance stuff because it's just really not fun for me. And I think generally prefer games that are a bit looser where it's like, wow, this thing that's really good, nobody bid on it, so I can buy it for 3. That feels really good. Like it's an exciting moment of imbalance, as opposed to when things get too balanced. It's like I can pay 7 for 14 points or 6 for 12 points. That's like the same thing. Who cares? My choices don't really matter. So it both, I think, leads to a more fun experience and also means less work for me. And also generally means the games are going to be simpler, which over the last year or two has been a really, really important thing for me, is to make simpler games. First 80% is the most fun. Back 20% kind of sucks. But if the game is simple enough that you don't really need to balance it, it's not too bad.
Yeah, it reminds me of, like, certain other games. I already mentioned Power Grid, but I like how like there's a minimum price for a power plant, but then after that there's an auction if there's going to be an auction. Or like talking about simple games, it kind of just players determine the value of things. I was thinking of like No Thanks, where it's just you can either pass it or add more to it, and it's like nothing there has like a fixed cost really, and I think that's an interesting aspect of things.
Well, you mentioned auction also, which one of the recent games that you helped develop and sort of redesign has a very interesting auction mechanic in Merchants of Andromeda. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and the process of like developing a Knizia?
Yeah, so that was really cool. Basically, Joe from All Play reached out to me about an old Knizia game that I had heard of but never played because it looks horribly ugly. I'm not going to convince anybody to play that with me. Called Merchants of Amsterdam. And I knew that the main gimmick, so to speak, was the Dutch auction, where there's this auction clock and it starts counting down from like 200, and every few seconds it gets cheaper and cheaper. The first person to like slam the clock wins the auction and pays the price showing on the clock. So the longer you wait, the cheaper it'll get, but if you don't jump on it, you might totally miss out. So there's the tension there of a Dutch auction, which is a real thing. Dutch auctions are a real type of auction that are run in the world. I ended up playing the game because All Play asked me if I would be interested in developing it. So I said, let me go play it and see if I'd be interested. And the game was absolutely, the shining star of the game was the Dutch auction. Everything around it was so-so. I wrote a lot about this in a developer diary I did, which is I think it's on BGG under Merchants of Andromeda's page. So I won't go, super duper deep into the nitty gritty of it. If you want to read about it, you can read about it there. But the general gist is that everything around the Dutch auction was a little old. It felt old. Knizia's games have a tendency of actually not feeling old, of feeling fresh. Like if somebody told me, Raw's from 1999, I'd be like, no way. Raw feels fresh, unique, exciting today. It doesn't feel old at all. But no, it's like more than 20 years old now. Same with Through the Desert. It also feels timeless. But, some of his games do age. This was one of them. So the real challenge with this one was keeping what made the core of it fun, but changing everything else out almost and modernizing it. And Joe's idea was to create mini games that are kind of inspired by arcade games a little bit. So you have like an Invaders one, some stuff like that. We, I think, accomplished that task. We created mini games around it that serve the Dutch auction and make the Dutch auction even more fun, because now you're auctioning off the opportunity to play a mini game, as opposed to in the original version, you're auctioning off essentially, I'm going to put a piece in this zone and every zone scores an area majority, which is a little less exciting than like, I'm going to go explore a planet. I'm going to go vote. I'm going to go fight the invaders. All these different mini games you can play. It was a lot of fun. It was also a very fast turnaround. And while I did, kind of quote unquote work with Knizia, there was very little, actually there was no direct interaction. There was always some middleman. Like I would say something to Joe. Joe, I think, would tell one of Knizia's assistants, and then the assistant would tell Knizia. So there was 2 middle people between me and him, but that might be the closest I ever actually get to working with him. So it was super fun, obviously an honor, and I'm glad I got to do it.
Do you enjoy like developing games more, or like designing like your own new premises for games? Like, which aspect do you find more enjoyable?
Oh, designing all the way. I mean, developing is like that last 20%, which is the part that a few minutes ago was like I hate it. So I don't like that part. Although with Andromeda, it was really design. It was very close to designing because it was almost like somebody was like, here's a core, like action selection mechanism in an auction for a game, but now design the game around it. I wasn't just like tweaking numbers for existing mini games. I designed the mini games. I also altered like how the cards work. So a lot of it did feel like designing, which was fun for me. I think if it was already at the 90% stage and I was doing the last 10%, I wouldn't have really wanted to or enjoyed it that much. I may have still said yes just for Kinetia brownie points, but I don't think I would have really done it. Here it was more like at the 30% stage, and it's like, okay, now we need to finish this thing. So there was still quite a bit of design work to do, and so I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
I guess there's a next question. He's asked if you like developing your own games, but what I was thinking about is like, how often do you go back and play a game after you've designed and developed it? Go back and play your own game.
It depends on how tired I am of it. Often I am very tired of it, but sometimes people will be like, we bought this game because we know you made it. Can you teach us? And that's like, yeah, I'll teach you. Of course I will. I can't say no. You went out and bought the game.
That's something I was thinking about. Because like you said, like that last 20% is like the least fun part for you anyway. So it's like, you're probably like already thinking like, I just want to be done with this for now. Because your last experience was the least fun part,
I think it also depends on how simple the game is. Like Tic Tac Boom, which was the game that Aaron alluded to, which is my next game coming out with Bitewing. I finished that in like 2 weeks, and it's like so simple that I haven't grown tired of it, and I think I could play it forever because I didn't have that experience of like staring at its board for like hours a day trying to figure out where certain numbers should go. Like with Shuffle and Swing, which had a like the longest development process of any game I've ever done, I don't think I can play that game for like a few years. I don't want to see it. I don't want to look at it. I've stared at it for too long, tried to number crunch stuff. Something simpler like Tic Tac Boom, I could play like right now, I'd play it. Moon Rollers 2, I'm like, yeah, sure, easy enough, I'll play it. I'm a little tired of it just because, it's a lightish game. Playing anything 100 times will probably get tired of it, but I'll play it. So I think it really has to do with how long I spent on the game, and that has to do with how simple the game is. The simpler, the less time I've spent on it. So it's much easier for me to get back into it and enjoy it instead of remembering like, oh man, maybe that should have been 4 after all. Maybe I should have made that 5. And then kind of like having this moment of like, did I mess up? And if a game is like too complicated or at least, somewhat complicated, it's easier for me to like think about like, oh, maybe that was wrong. Maybe it should be this way, and try to think about how I should change it, kind of retrospectively. Because at this point, the stuff that's out, I was done working with 2 years ago, so I've grown, and I think I would do better now than I did back then, and so that kind of bugs me. But if a game is like so pure that it's like, what would you really change about this, like Tic Tac Boom, then I can enjoy it and would happily play it today.
For our listeners, why don't you just give a quick rundown, since it is so simple, of Tic Tac Boom and how it works and what the concept is?
So it is tic-tac-toe with memory and push your luck. So there are 9 tiles. 4 of them are X's, 4 of them are O's, and 1 of them is a bomb. 1 player is the X's, 1 player is the O's. You shuffle up the 9 tiles and you put them in a 3x3 grid. Your objective is to flip 3 of your tiles in a row. Diagonal, row, column, whatever. Just like tic-tac-toe. If you're the X's, you want to get 3 X's in a row. If you're the O's, you want to get 3 O's in a row. And off to the side are 9 action cards, 2 of which are face up. So on your turn, you pick an action card to do. So it might be like, look at 2 tiles secretly, and then you can swap one of them with another tile. Or it might be like, look at as many tiles as you want, but if you see the bomb, you lose. So you either use one of those 2 action cards for your turn, or you decide to go for it. And if you go for it, you flip 3 tiles in a row. If they're yours, you win. If you flip the bomb, you lose. Otherwise, like if you flip, like 2 of yours and 1 of your opponents, then that's just your whole turn. You just showed your opponent 3 of the tiles, so you wasted your turn and also gave them a ton of info, and then it's their turn again.
Then do they go back afterwards?
Yeah, they go back. They go back face down afterwards.
Oh, so they don't stay face up.
They do not. Everything gets flipped face down. Yeah, so it's a memory game
with stuff shifting around. Sounds neat.
With stuff shifting around. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be. I'd love to try it when it comes out. I think it'd be real fun. It seems like a very intriguing take on a classic game that everybody knows. I mean, everybody's played tic-tac-toe,
Mhm.
basically. And it seems like it takes away one of the aspects of tic-tac-toe that I think everybody gets frustrated with eventually. A lot of times when you play tic-tac-toe, it comes in a draw, and this doesn't sound like it'll end in a draw.
It cannot end in a draw. Yeah, right. It's not solvable because there's enough randomness and like, somebody else is moving tiles around, and also your memory fails you, which is the funniest parts of the game, where it's like, dang it, I saw the bomb. Was it there or was it there? Like, you would think 9 tiles is easy enough to remember, but after 2 minutes, you might have forgotten. Or your opponent might have like swapped stuff and you're like, wait, did they swap it to the middle or to the diagonal? I don't remember. And that's where the fun moments come.
Yet it also seems simple enough at the same time that you could teach like a 9 or 10-year-old how to play or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, kids have been enjoying it, which makes me happy. I'm happy that I have a game that kids can play, adults can play, kids can play with adults. Basically, if you can read and you understand how tic-tac-toe works, you're set. That's it.
Yeah, I'm excited for that one to come out. So you've worked with Bitewing on a couple of your games, right? And you've worked with a couple other companies on like other different games. Do you find that since you've worked with Bitewing like the most and you have that relationship build, that like when you have a new design, you'll go to them first and see if they're interested? Or what do you do when you have a new design that you think is ready to be like brought to a publisher?
Being friends with Bitewing and having a close relationship with them is a blessing, largely, but also slightly a curse, where it's just so easy now to be like, to literally message Nick and be like, hey, Nick, I'm working on something. Want to check it out? He'll say, yeah. He'll just say, yeah. I don't have to make a sell sheet. I don't have to pitch it to him. He'll just say, yeah, which is great. I'm grateful for that relationship because we have 6 games signed together now in total. So, obviously we like working with each other. It's not all the time he'll say like, yeah, I want that game. Half the time he'll be like, yeah, I want that game. And then it's like, well, I could either spend, months cold calling other people, trying to find another publisher, or I could just say yeah and go with Bitewing. So it's very tempting to just say yes and go with Bitewing, which I'm almost always happy to do. But I do have this like worry of like, is that too many eggs in one basket? Like that's kind of in the back of my head sometimes from both our ends, right? Because if something happens to Bitewing, then I have all these designs that are just like dead now. Or if my games don't do well, Bitewing has a bunch of my games now on their list, and it's like, I don't want us to become too interlinked. So that's why it's slightly a curse. But largely it's a blessing. And yeah, I always go to Bitewing first pretty much.
Do you ever come up with a design and you're looking at it and just saying like, well, this doesn't fit what they've been doing so far. Should I probably shop at other publishers kind of thing? Or does it just happen that you tend to design games that are good for what they're doing?
Yeah, that's the problem. I tend to design games that they like or are good for what they're doing. Like I'm not going to make a heavy Euro. I'm not going to make a solo game, right? The kinds of games I'm going to make are generally the kinds of games they want to publish. And even like I've signed a game with them, the one I was talking about that Aaron's play tested, which is larger than anything they've done, but they still liked it enough to publish it. They're like, no, we want to do this. So even stuff that's slightly out of their comfort zone, if it's only slightly out, they're still inclined if they like it enough to publish it. But sometimes I'll have like a publisher reach out to me directly and say like, hey, can you work on this? Like Andromeda. And then I have another project with All Play that hasn't been announced yet. It won't be for a while probably, but they also reached out and were like, hey, do you want to work on this for us? And then there's no choice but to work on it with the publisher who asked you about it. Or IV has asked me to work on expansions. Like I've done expansions for Veiled Fate and for Fractured Sky. Sometimes it'll be a direct, publisher asking me.
I think one interesting thing just talking to you is that it seems like you've worked on a lot of games. Do you think having a quick turnaround is like a boon in this industry?
I think so. I haven't been able to do it full time yet, but I've looked at how people have done it full time, and it seems to me you either create a game system like the Exit series or something like that, where you can just like keep quote unquote easily adding, new content to it or making spin-offs of that game that can sustain you. You can have just like one huge breakout hit, like your Gloomhaven or your Wingspan or whatever. Or my approach, and what I would call the Knizia approach, is just like shotgun, just like make a bunch of stuff, see what sticks, because who knows? The last thing I want to do is spend like years making my baby, so to speak, and then it not doing well. That would seem like a huge waste of time. So instead, I'm just trying to pump out as much stuff as I can, as fast as I can. And then hopefully one of those sticks. And then the one that sticks ends up being like 75% of your income. And then the other like 30 games are like the remaining 25% combined. So I think you just have to keep going until you get a big enough hit. Or until you have so many games that like by 100 games active in the market, like, that's going to be enough for you to be, full time. Even if they're all making a little bit, 100 times a little bit is quite a lot.
What's your background, if you don't mind me asking? Like, what's your current day job? Because you said you do it part-time.
Mm-hmm. So in college, I majored in economics, and I wanted to do a PhD in economics. So I started working as a research assistant for a professor in UPenn, which is kind of like the canonical path to go into a PhD. You basically do that for 2 years to see if you actually like that kind of work. Turns out I did not like that kind of work. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but it was around that point that I had also started designing games and kind of like having a sense of like, maybe I can do this or at least try it. It was like the last few months of that 2-year gig where I got the Luminor job from IV, the Moonrakers digital thing. So I was like, okay, maybe it's possible. So since then, I have been doing math tutoring part-time. Tutoring was the first job I got. Like out of high school, I did that and I liked it. And I like math, and so I've just been doing that. That's been my other part-time job, and I've been trying to like slowly increase, the game design hours, and hopefully, who knows what it is over the next 2 to 6 years, however long it takes, game design can slowly creep up, and then that'll be 100%, and tutoring will be slowly creeping down until it hits 0%.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was actually an econ major too, and I didn't end up doing much with that. But I realized before an internship, whatever, that I didn't want to do econ PhDs.
There's a lot of stuff from that I think I ended up using in game design. Mm-hmm. They're very similar, right? Because economics is kind of a study of incentives in a lot of ways, and so that's what a game design is. You create, we could say, an economy for the players to live in, and you need to set up right incentives. So I think about trade-offs, opportunity costs, loss aversion, all this stuff that came out of econ. Maybe not super consciously, but I think it's always in the back of my mind. I always think about like what are some interesting trade-offs I can create for the players, for example. Or, going back to like not wanting to balance stuff, I, instead of thinking about like how much money should something cost, I think about opportunity cost. You have 3 things you can do, you got to pick one. So the cost is not doing the other 2. I think it's been helpful. It seems to me kind of like a natural transition in a way, but maybe I'm just kind of rationalizing it that way for myself. No, I swear I'm still using my degree, even though I'm not. But yeah, no, I think it does make sense though that somebody who'd be interested in economics is also interested in game design. They seem to me similar enough in a lot of ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, like Panizzi was a math major or a math professor, right? It's in the same general area.
Yeah, I'm actually finding a lot of academics in game design. Sometimes I'll meet somebody and they'll be like, yeah, I'm also a professor of psychology at this university. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. I think something about academia and math is similar enough to games that like somebody who likes math but is also like creative-ish, it's kind of like the perfect in-between. Science and art, let's say, it's kind of like a combination of the two. Obviously, that doesn't mean you need to be good at math or whatever. I don't think that's true. But I think it just like it lends itself to people who are interested in math.
Yeah, and a lot of games in their own sense have an economy of their own. Like Summoner Wars, for example, has very much an economy of like these cards are a limited thing that you're using. There's also magic in play, a money element. So a lot of games have an aspect of that.
Going back to Summoner Wars, I guess, tell us a little bit about how you found it and when you found it. Was it also during the COVID time?
Yes, it was, and I think it was Dice Tower. I think it must be Tom who's had it in his top 100 for a while. Mm-hmm. And I think I got it when the second edition was first coming out. So I hadn't played first edition Summoner Wars. I think I maybe was aware of it, just like as being a game, but I never picked it up. But when the second edition came out, I picked it up. And I played it for like a month. I had it for like 2 or 3 months. I maybe played it 5 or 6 times. The problem was that I couldn't get somebody to play it with me consistently. So I would like show it to somebody and I would stomp. And I wasn't necessarily trying to. It would just be like, I've played it before and you haven't. And so like I would even try a different faction or whatever. Even if I didn't stomp them, it did still feel kind of like there was an asymmetry of knowledge. Like I just knew more about the game. There's enough like, keywords and stuff or like, maybe unwritten rules that you get with experience that when you play for the first time, it's much more about discovery than it is about like really playing it. You can't really like play it until you've played a few times and you understand, the keywords. So there's always this imbalance in it. And I never found anybody who loved it enough to like keep it as a consistent, 2-player game. Because that's, I think, when it would be the best, when you have 2, equally experienced players going at it. Like that to me seems like a great time. If I found that person, I would have kept it because I like a lot of things about it.
I think both for Aaron and I, we both struggle to have someone in our circles that plays it as much as we do. But that's why we've created a podcast and play online and do all that because we like the game so much. But then it was like we can find those consistent, strong players by just the community. But then that makes it even harder to find someone in real life that we're just going to teach, because it's like
now you're that much better.
I mean, I'm not as good as Aaron, but I've still played like thousands of games. So that's just a lot.
He's downplaying it. He's played the most online out of anybody. No, it's often talked about in the community as like a thing that exists. Like you either bounce off Summoner Wars and you don't like the game, or you like the game enough where like you get pretty good at it and then you don't have anybody to play with unless you can find someone else who like really likes the game. Because when you start playing like Summoner Wars casually, if you like start playing it a lot, you're going to get a lot better. And then whoever's playing it with casually with you, whether it's a spouse or a friend or whoever, if they don't also play a lot, then eventually you're either got to start like either throwing your games or you're going to be too good for them and it doesn't work out well. So, but the online aspect obviously helps with that and hurts that a little bit. It's an interesting design. When you play other games like Summoner Wars or other games that you enjoy, are there from like the design aspect, do you ever look at a game and think like, oh, I could have designed this just a little bit better, or I would have changed this design a little bit? Or
not really. I think I have like a player mode and like a designer mode, and they are bleeding into each other a little bit. So I mean, for me to like go into that thing of like I would have done this, I think either the game has to be really bad, like noticeably bad, and it's like, there's obvious things that I can't switch off my designer brain. But if the game is, a published game for the most part, I probably won't put that, that hat on. I'll just be thinking as a player,
how do I win now?
Yeah, but there are some times where I'll like a game but not love it in a frustrating way. So this happened with like Babylonian Samurai, where like I was like, I'm gonna love it. I read the rules, I was pumped for both games, and neither game was I able to love. And so then that's when I started thinking like, okay, what would I have done differently? Or like, what do I wish was happening in the game? And that's kind of like how Bebop was born. So it's like the only example of me playing a game or games and being like, I don't love them. How can I make myself love them? And then design my own game based off of them. But for the most part, I just try to turn that designer part off. And, the part of the designer brain that is on is more like admiration, like, oh man, that's so cool. I love how they were able to like evoke this feeling or this kind of table talk which is such a simple rule set. I think the most recent example of this, I played Mexica for the first time a while ago. And I was just like in awe of how sandboxy the game felt, of how open it felt with so few rules. There's moments like that where I'll play like an older game from one of the great designers and just be like, dang it, how do they do that every time? And that's kind of like more inspiring than trying to fix it. So it's less about fixing it and more about being inspired or in awe of what another designer has done.
So what I heard there, though, was if you throw in Merchants of Amsterdam, that's 3 Knizias are the only games you thought were just like so bad you had to redesign it. I mean,
yeah, I guess that's what happens when you make 800 games. You're gonna have some of this.
When you make so many, some of them got to not hit with everybody.
But the crazy thing is, like, Babylonia is like a 10 out of 10 for quite a few people out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I played it. It's pretty fun.
I don't get it, man. I don't get it.
Going back to Summoner Wars, though, did you ever play First Edition?
No, I did not.
Okay. Because that's like an interesting, both in Summoner Wars and in design aspects, like an interesting take of like, because First Edition I loved also. And James actually helped design some of the factions for First Edition. He used to
cool.
be one of the lead playtesters for Plaid Hat. First Edition had some flaws that were fairly obvious for people who had played a lot of games.
And they just kept getting kicked down the road. And instead of trying to actually change those rules, they would like release a new faction or a new card that would try to fix it.
Okay.
So they kind of like just bolted these things on until eventually, I think it sort of collapsed under its own weight. Let's say there was a weak champion early on or something. They would release a new a card or champion that would try to make that champion better. Instead of just now, like they will release errata or change cards if they have a real problem.
Got it. Okay.
That's tricky for them as a publisher now to have this recurring thing of occasionally making new versions of cards. I think they're doing their best job of appeasing the online fan base while also appealing to new players.
And financially keeping it viable.
Yeah.
But like another couple aspects of the design of first edition is it was like very turtly at times. A lot of the high level players were like there was no punishment for not moving or not like forcing the issue and attacking your opponent. So
Okay.
you would just force them to come to you, and then when they came to you, you had the advantage because you didn't walk into the trap. And
So now they have the if you don't attack, you lose a health or whatever. That's new.
yep,
Yeah.
yeah, the
Yeah.
inactivity. So that was new, and like you used to be able to destroy your own units and cards for magic.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
So the opening moves would be killing all your own guys.
yeah, which when you're teaching a new person is like super counterintuitive because you're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
all right, I'm a very experienced Summoner Wars player. I'm going to open up. I have 7 units on the battlefield. I'm going to try and kill 3 of them. And you're like, but I'm your opponent. You're killing your own guys.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I would have liked the game at all. But I also don't think I would have realized that. So maybe I would have still liked it. I don't think I would have realized to do something so counterintuitive.
I think teaching new players, I wouldn't do it. Or a lot of times with Summoner Wars in general, even in second edition, it's good to have 2 new players face off when you're demoing the game or teaching the game rather than jumping in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a situation where you're trying to get a close friend or a spouse to start playing, they're going to be playing with you, so you kind of have to teach them that way.
Bite the bullet. And
The coolest thing about Summoner Wars for me compared to these other like 2-player duelers is that it puts it on a board, on a grid.
mm-hmm.
Because I don't think I have a game without a grid. I put everything on like grids are just so fun for me because you get all these like subtleties that you wouldn't have without a grid, where it's like, okay, if I put a gate here, that means you can't move into that spot anymore, which might like matter. It's like things all of a sudden have like different effects, like knock-on effects. And also it makes it feel like there's a real sense of like place and time now. Like I'm here, you're there, and I need to like get closer to you. That for whatever reason like really matters to me in a lot of games, whereas like Magic or something, or just like a pure card game where I'm like, I don't know where I am. Like, where is this unit? I don't know where he is. Like even a lane, it's like it's not quite the same as being like he's here on A7. Like that just feels so much more impactful and real and easier for me to parse. So that was my favorite part of it compared to all the other kind of dueler games like that I've played. It's like there's a sense of place, and you get all these cool knock-on effects from placement.
That's, I think, one of the things I like the best about it too, is that the spatial component just really changes the way that kind of game plays.
Mm-hmm.
Even in other games too, like I already mentioned Power Grid, but all these other games where you have, or Settlers of Catan, a lot of these classics, you have a shared board where you do something, and then you can have very simple rules, but they're expanded just by the fact that you don't just put a card down, you can put it down in one of 8 different spots.
Yeah.
And then that's based on the relative positions of whatever else is going on. And why, like, personally, I kind of bounce off of like worker placement games, because like the board isn't really a board, it's just like a location for where things are, like what your choices are, but it's not like a physical different like spatial relationship.
Yeah, and the premise of Summoner Wars, the designer Colby came from a background of Heroescape, and so he almost wanted it to be like a miniature, like Heroescape style game, but just with cards and a board. And so that, I think, was the background that put Summoner Wars in that impact. Are there any board games that you feel like have really intricate designs that you really love? Ones that like set themselves apart from other games in the industry?
Well, speaking of something like Summoner Wars, I think what I've ended up playing as my Summoner Wars replacement, because I found somebody, my brother, who would actually dig in with it with me, is Tash Kalar. Have either of you guys played Tash Kalar?
I played it one time.
Yeah, that ended up being the game.
That's a Vlada Fadl, right?
Yeah. It's similar to Summoner Wars in that like you have, unique factions with your own hand of cards. The cards don't go on the board, but they kind of do. It's a lot more abstract and less random. Like there's no die roll for stuff. It feels more like an abstract game and more like a Euro game, but still has those moments of like you can do what, and just like crazy stuff happening on the board. That's been like the 2-player game that I've been digging into lately. I think if you like Summoner Wars, you'd probably like that. There seems like a decent amount of crossover. I don't know. I can't confirm. I haven't like done a survey, but I think you would. So I like that one a lot. Other designs that I just admire endlessly. Botswana or Wildlife Safari. I think 25th Century is doing a new printing of that this year. It's a Knizia game that has almost no rules. It's secretly a stock game, And to me, it's like the perfect game. It's not like my favorite game of all time, but I think it's just perfect. It is so simple, but endlessly fun. I can't see it ever getting old. So I would say Botswana is one that I admire greatly. And then also, as far as party games go, Just One. It's like, why didn't I figure that out? That was just out there for anybody in the universe to figure out, and these two guys did. So I love Just One.
Yeah, Just One's good. In that vein, like of games that like you think like, why didn't I think of that as like another simple party game that I like a lot was Codenames when that came out. That was like the hit of Gen Con. I think it's because like when it's late at Gen Con, it makes the most sense to play a game that's simple.
Yeah.
And I had one of the funnier moments in that game. There was this game designer who was playing. He hit the assassin because he's like, Apple's a business, and like I like my clue had been business. He picked Apple, thinking that the Apple was a business.
That's amazing.
But it's like I hadn't thought of it that way.
Dang, Vlada. Speaking of, not just games but designers one admires, Vlada is crazy. I don't know how he has so many different games. Yeah.
I played Galaxy Trucker a little bit ago, and that was a lot of fun too.
That's a good one. Galaxy Trucker's a fun one.
Although it kind of does something that a lot of people don't like, Justin, that like your thing gets destroyed over the course of a game. A lot of people like to see something build up, so that's an interesting risk to take, but I think it paid off for him.
When my ship gets cut in half, though, I will choose a side, and we'll ride with that. I think we're in, I don't know if I should say like a golden age, but I mean, this is the best maybe board games have ever been, and we have the luxury of having tons of great designs and more coming out all the time. So
yeah, I would agree. I think for sure there's more games being put out than ever. And the part that makes me a little sad is there's like a lot of older gems that are just like forgotten about, but they still feel fresh today. I mean, sometimes they get reprinted, like a lot of Kenichi's games. There's some publishers who do reprints, like Bitewing and 25th Century and All Play. But I would say, even though we are in this like golden age right now, don't miss out on the oldies but goldies. There's some good ones in there.
There's a podcast I listen to that I like, just called Cult of the Old, where they every game has to be at least 10 years old for them to talk about it. And
nice.
That's what they'll do.
Love that.
They do some hits like, Cosmic Encounter and Ticket to Ride and stuff like that, but they'll do other stuff too that's a little deeper cut now and then too.
I wonder how long that podcast has been around, because if that podcast was around like 30 years ago, they would have had like 10 games to talk about.
No, they're just on like their third season. It's pretty new podcast, but I like that one.
Well, Robert, we appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking board games and Summoner Wars and all sorts.
Yeah, lots of fun. Thanks for having me.
This has been another episode of Discard for Magic, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.